me, that's what books are. They're a way for us to have these really uncomfortable conversations and also hopefully be able to talk to people who might not share the same feelings about a topic as us. But through a story, we can talk about it. We can talk about it in a respectful way and have an actual conversation.
Howdy and welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell. My guest today is author Jasmine Warga. Jasmine is the New York Times bestselling author of middle grade novels Other Words for Home and The Shape of Thunder. Other Words for Home earned multiple awards, including a John Newbery Honor, a Walter Honor for Young Readers, and a Charlotte Huck Honor. The Shape of Thunder was a school library journal and Bank Street Best Book of the Year, a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Children and YA Book Award, and has been named to several state award reading lists. Jasmine is also the author of young adult books My Heart and Other Black Holes and Here We Are Now, which have been translated into over 20 different languages. Her next novel, A Rover Story, will be out on October 4th, 2022. Jasmine currently teaches in the MFA program at Vermont College of Fine Arts. Originally from Cincinnati, she now lives in the Chicago area with her family in a house filled with books. Jasmine, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Yay, I'm thrilled to be here.
Okay, so let's start with A Rover Story. This is a middle grade novel about a Mars rover that develops human emotions and his explorations and adventures on the Red Planet. So that's a really fun, I love like sci-fi and space exploration stuff. So I was like excited to read about that. What was your inspiration for writing this story, and what made you decide that an anthropomorphized rover was the right protagonist for you?
Yeah, it's funny because I almost viewed it as my pandemic book, and that I feel like if the pandemic hadn't happened, I'm not sure I ever would have written this book. It's very different from any other book I've written before.
Yeah.
But basically how it came about was in July 2020, my youngest daughter, who's really into space, she was 3 years old at the time, asked me if we could watch the rover launch. And I didn't even realize, that the rover launch was happening that day. I wasn't particularly that into or interested in Mars rovers. But I kind of did that mom calculus that I think a lot of people who are parents remember from the pandemic of being like, that feels like an educational screen activity. So I'm going to say yes to that. And I'd assumed, that I would put it on and I would rush to the other room, to get some like free time to either work on the book that I was working on at the time or something else. But when I turned it on, I instantly found myself super magnetized by the news story, listening to the NASA scientists who had been working on this rover for years and years. And I started to feel emotional because it was a time right when our world felt really broken and really sad. But remembering, the power of human ingenuity and creativity. And so I sat there with my daughters and we were all watching it. And then the launch happens and it looks like it's successful. The rocket is going up into the sky, and my oldest daughter is standing up on the couch and she's clapping. But the younger one, the one who had asked me to turn it on, looks concerned. And I was, a little bit worried. I'm like, Junie, no, look, the rocket, it's going up. It's fine. And she's like, yeah, but mommy, do you think the robot is scared? And from there, I was like, oh my gosh, that's a great question. What a wonderful question. What a wonderful human question. And I just thought somebody should write that book. But I didn't really think I would necessarily be the person to write that book. But the idea didn't let go. Like I kept thinking about it. I kept wondering about it. I kept wondering, is the robot scared? Is the robot sad to be leaving Earth? Does the robot feel isolated? I think again in 2020, I was thinking a lot about what it meant to be alone, what it meant to be away from people that we love. And so I started doing some research on the NASA website. And the more I learned about the rovers, the more I learned about the Rover project, the more I was like, I want to write this book. And I say that it's surprising to me that I wrote this book just because in terms of a protagonist, it's so different from things I've done before. Right. But looking back on like my pattern of things that I loved as a kid, like Charlotte's Web was one of my very, very favorite books. So the idea of narrators that aren't human are, I think, something that has always appealed to me. It was just new for me to try it in my own writing.
That's awesome. It's so easy to anthropomorphize or like relate to anything that has like human emotions. And so it doesn't really matter whether it's human or not. And I think that's pretty universal.
Yeah, no, in lots of ways, Res, which is the name of my Rover, is my non-human narrator. In lots of ways, it's my book that's the most about what does it mean to be a human, because he wonders
Yeah.
a lot about human emotions and if he's having them and what that means. And so I think it was a fun angle to talk about these things that sometimes when you're dealing with a human protagonist, you just assume like they know what sadness is, or they know
Right.
what those things are.
Yeah. So since your book is coming out in early October, you are about to go on book tour. So you have like a bunch of events and things lined up to promote the launch. So what is that going to look like for you? And like what events are you most looking forward to?
Yeah, so I'm really excited. This will be the first time in a long time I've really gotten to hit the road to launch a
Yeah.
book since when the Sheba Thunder came out, it was still like everything was virtual. And so
Hmm.
for this book, I'm going to do a lot of fun things. The book tour is kind of starting the weekend before the book comes out at Decatur
Yeah.
Book Festival, which is in the
Okay.
Atlanta area. And it's a huge book festival. I've attended once as like a reader. It was right before my first book was coming out, and it was so fun to be there and see so many authors I admired. So now I'm so excited to
Yeah.
participate and get to go down there. And Little Shop of Stories is the indie bookstore there that supports the book festival, and they're awesome. And then
Nice.
I'm going to be launching the book here in my hometown of Naperville, Illinois, which is a little bit outside of Chicago,
Hmm.
Anderson's Bookshop. So that will happen on the actual October 4th. And then I will
Nice.
be in Milwaukee, I think, on October 5th, in Columbus on October 8th, and I think in St. Louis on October 11th, and then maybe in Pittsburgh on October 12th. So there's a lot of like moving pieces going around.
That's
And
a
then,
whirlwind.
yeah, it's going to be a whirlwind. And then it's kind of capping off like that main tour part with the Texas Book Festival in Austin, Texas. So
Mm,
I'm
nice.
looking forward to hopefully meeting lots of readers and getting to talk about how fun Mars rovers are.
Yeah, so probably a lot of my audience have heard of book tours and know the authors do them, but like what is it actually like for you? Do you like have speaking events? Do you do reading? Is it just like you have a booth and people walk up to you? Like what are the events like from the author perspective?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit. There's different events. So, for example,
Hmm.
when I'm doing a festival, lots of times what
Hmm.
has happened is my publisher has pitched me to go to the festival, and if the festival says like, yes, we'd love to have Jasmine, they'll put me on a
Hmm.
panel usually, and so that panel will usually be
Okay.
with other authors who they kind of pair us sometimes by like the age range of people we write for. So I might be on like a
Hmm.
middle grade book panel, or maybe I'll be on a
Hmm.
middle grade sci-fi panel, or maybe I'll just be on a sci-fi
Hmm.
panel. It kind of depends how the festival decides to group it. And then usually there's like a signing line, right? That usually happens kind
Yeah.
of after your panel. But for the
Uh-huh.
sort of the book tour events where they'll like send me to a city, for a middle grade book, usually how it works is you do school visits during the day. So you go around to lots
Hmm.
of different middle schools and you get to talk with kids there about the book and sort of present about the book. Sometimes they have book signing there too, like the school has purchased books and you sign them for the students. And then
Hmm.
lots of times there's an evening event at the bookstore. But
Hmm.
again, in the middle grade space, lots of times those evening events are held at local libraries or things like that make it a little bit more kid family friendly space. But when I've done young adult book tours before, a lot of times the event was at the actual bookstore. So that kind of, I think, varies. Not to say I've done like my Anderson's one will be at Anderson. So sometimes it is
Yeah.
at the bookstore. And lots of times you get to be in conversation with someone who is like a friend who lives in the city. So maybe another author friend. Or for
Yeah.
me, some of my like teacher librarian friends are going to help me out and be kind of my conversation partner for those evening events.
Nice. That sounds super fun and very exhausting all at the same time.
Yeah, that's how I would kind of describe it. Because I think some people think book tour and they think it sounds really glamorous. And there are things about it that are really glamorous, right? I think the whole job of being a writer at the end of the day is really glamorous. And it's all I've ever wanted to do. So I feel so lucky that I get
Yeah.
to do this. Then I feel even more lucky when, I get to go to another city and talk about my book. But a lot of it is also like, being at airports really early in the morning and eating a granola bar on your way to your next school visit and,
Yeah.
being in like a hotel room for a couple of hours and then leaving to go back to the airport. So it is all of those things you're talking about. It's exciting
Right.
and I feel really lucky to get to do it. And it can also be very exhausting.
Yeah. Do you ever take your daughters or your family on book tour with you, or is it strictly a work thing?
Yeah, usually it's strictly a work thing. Like sometimes we'll arrange, like they'll come to my launch party since it's in town, and
Hmm.
their job is they're gonna hand out cookies, which we're having made that will like
Oh,
be themed like Mars and spaceship cookies.
nice.
But most of the time they'll be at home because they have school now, and so my mom's gonna come and help out, and also my mother-in-law, and kind of hold down the fort here, help out my husband. But when they were little, like really little, I remember I brought them to a couple of book tour events because they were more
Hmm.
local. Like we went back to Ohio, which is where I'm from originally, and I brought them to that one. But it was also a book that was coming out like closer to summer, so pulling them
Hmm.
wasn't as tricky. But usually it's just
Gotcha.
me. They're
Nice.
sort of like desensitized to me leaving for book things now, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay, so The Shape of Thunder is your most recent book that came out in 2021. It is about the friendship of two girls whose lives were torn apart by a school shooting, and then it follows them as they try to figure out how to travel through time and stop it from happening. That's a really cool concept, but also like such a heavy topic for a middle grade novel. So I know that kind of stuff can also be like really politically charged sometimes. So were you like worried that that would be off-putting to like the parents who would be buying the book, or why was this story important for you to tell?
Yeah, no, I definitely worried about that. I worried
Mhm.
a lot because I didn't like my intention with the book was never to write a super political book. The idea was
Right,
to write a
sure.
book that I was hoping was going to help crack open this conversation that I think
Mhm.
a lot of parents want to have with their young people and don't know how to have, and that young people want to talk about but don't have a forum to talk about, because I think that oftentimes the books that covered this issue were for like teenagers, and I realized
Mhm.
that so many of my readers that I was meeting were carrying all these fears and anxieties around this. Like I started to notice this when I was touring for Other Words for Home and I was doing lots of school visits, how
Mhm.
schools today are designed around this issue in a way that when I went to school, active
Right.
shooter drills were not a part of what we did. There was not all this security to get into the building. There wasn't always this like almost constant awareness of this being a really present threat. And
Mhm.
so I was thinking about the fact that our kids really bear so much of this responsibility, right? They do these
Mhm.
drills and they're taught what to do and how to do it, and we design their schools around it. And so I was thinking about the idea of responsibility and who's bearing the weight of
Mhm.
this responsibility. And so the book is kind of like an extended metaphor for that idea of like
Mhm.
who is left holding these pieces and how can we talk about this thing that scares all of us and makes all of us really upset. And one of the things
Mhm.
that I think the book touches on, and then I say in the end of the book, the author's note, is that one of the things that frustrates me the most about this issue is it is a really complicated issue, because when you
Mhm.
start to talk about it, if somebody says, well, it's the guns, then somebody else says, well, it's mental health, then somebody else says, well, it's our toxic culture, this doesn't happen in other countries that have guns or mental health, and then we go in this circle, right? And I was
Right.
saying that my frustration is that I feel like it is a really complicated issue. I think it is all of those things. I think we can talk about all these things in a way that I hope like centers love and caring about one another, and that all of us,
Mhm.
I think, no matter how divided we are politically, want the best for our kids and want our kids
Right.
to feel safe. And the question is, how do we get there? How do we make the world better? And I have my ideas about that, but I'm not an expert, and the book isn't meant to be like a list of things to do, but more hopefully a way to crack open the conversation to say, like, hey, this is not normal and this is not
Right.
sustainable and this is not how it should always be for our kids. So, how can we change it? How can we make it better? And it's sad to me that I guess in the moment that we're in, you're right, that some people would feel that that's political, but to
Mhm.
me, that's more a human thing of someone like who
Right.
is a mom, and also who writes for young people and cares about young people, that I just want the world to be better for them. And I also want them to feel like they have a seat at the table in making the world a better place. And so for me, that's what books are. They're a way for us to have these really uncomfortable conversations and also hopefully be able to talk to people who might not share the same feelings about a topic as us,
Mhm.
but through a story we can talk about it, we can talk about it in a respectful way and have an actual conversation.
Yeah. That's great. Did writing the book help you figure out how to talk to your daughters about this, or is that just an ongoing conversation and you're
Yeah, I
with
mean,
your
I think
kids?
yes and no. I think my kids are still a little bit younger than the target
Mhm.
audience for the book. But I think in writing it, I've kind of crystallized how I want those conversations to look as they get older
Yeah.
and what that means. I mean, we've obviously had to have some of those conversations because they've started school, which was the impetus for wanting to write the book. Like, how do I talk to
Right.
my own kids about why there's active shooter drills at their school? Like, what does that say about the
Mhm.
world they live in? Like, why is the world the way it is? Like, I just feel like that's such a fracturing of the world that I tried to construct for them, and to then enter
Yeah.
that into it. So like that was a big reason I wrote the book, was fear about having that conversation. But I
Mhm.
definitely think it's informed because for me, that whole idea, what both Cora and Quinn really want is for the who are the main characters in the Shape of Thunder, is for the grown-ups in their life to really listen to them. And so for me,
Yeah.
it's hopefully when that time comes to have these more detailed conversations, is hopefully creating a forum where I give space for them to kind of share how they're feeling. Like, how does it make
Mhm.
them feel to have an active shooter drill? Because I think what a lot of our young people need is not so much us telling them like what our view on it is, but more just saying like, I see you. And I know this is a really difficult thing that you're going through, and I want
Mhm.
to make it better for you, but I also want you to know, like, I see you and I'm here to talk to you about your feelings. So,
Yeah.
sort of like, again, like centering the young reader was like my
Yeah.
whole goal in writing the book, and it centering them in the conversation, because I think oftentimes they're sort of pushed to the side when for me they are really the people who are bearing a lot of the weight.
That's awesome. I really like appreciate your take on that. I think that's wonderful. And I'm glad that people like you are writing books like
Awesome.
that.
Thank you.
So your third book is called Other Words for Home, and it is a middle grade book that came out in 2019. It is a story about a young girl who moves to Cincinnati from the Middle East and tries to find a sense of belonging in her new home. So you are from Cincinnati originally, and you are the daughter of immigrants. So how much of this story was inspired by you and your family's own stories?
Yeah, the story is completely fiction, since, as you said, like,
Mhm.
I was born here in the US. I was born actually in Cincinnati. And so I have the privilege of never having been an immigrant, let alone a refugee. But I do think, because in my own family history, my father is the son of refugees, and then my father himself is an immigrant. So I think I grew up with this understanding of how hard it is to leave home and how hard it is to
Mhm.
toggle between this place that you left and this new home that you're making, and how do you balance that, and how can more than one place be home? So that's a question that
Right.
informed my whole adolescence, this idea of like, what is home, and how can home be more than one place, and how can I have family who lives across the ocean, and what does that mean, and what ways does that make me different from my friend who lives
Mhm.
next door, who all of her family lives right here in this one small town in Ohio where I grew up. Those
Right.
are big questions that I wondered a lot about as a kid. But Jude's, who is the main character of Other Words for Home, is a girl who's growing up in Syria and is forced to move because of the conflict in Syria. And that's a very different, like, that is not a lived experience that I had. My own family is Palestinian Jordanian, so we're not
Mhm.
Syrian. But our
Right.
closest friends in Cincinnati, our closest family friends, are Syrian. And the book was inspired in part by watching the relationship I saw between cousins who have been born here in America and cousins who were coming over from Syria because of the conflict. And I started
Mhm.
thinking about what it would have been like for me when I was in middle school if my Middle Eastern or Arab cousins had come to move to Ohio. Because at that point in
Mhm.
my life, I was so insecure in my identity. And like, more than anything, I just wanted to fit in at school. I didn't want to be different. And I felt like all the media messaging I got was telling me that there was something really wrong with being Arab, and there was something really wrong with being Muslim, and that couldn't be Muslim and American, or you couldn't be Arab and American. And so it would have been really hard for me and my cousins to come, because I kind of would have blown up the like kind of camouflagey identity thing I had going on. And so I
Right.
initially thought the book was going to be told actually from Jude's American cousin's point of view. And then
Mhm.
it eventually, as books do, morphed into being Jude's story, which is a very, like I said, different story from my own. But I think that some of the emotional truths of the story, like I said, those big questions she asks about identity, are things that
Yeah.
I definitely wondered about as a young person.
Definitely. I read all these stories, about immigrants and refugees, and there's so many people that I know that have had those experiences, and it's just gut wrenching sometimes, like the things that take people away from their home because people have such an attachment to their home and like, what does home mean and things like that. So I think it's important for young people to hear those stories too.
Yeah, no, thank you. I definitely agree. I mean, I think that's a big part of why I wrote the book, is that I think there's this misunderstanding of like how difficult it is for kids like do like what they've lost. Like I think sometimes we have this misunderstanding in America of the whole Middle East, right? We think of it as a region that's perpetually at war and always at war. And so I think that when I go and I do school visits and I show kids pictures of the town that I based where Jude's from and show them like how normal her life was, that it looked just like their life. And what if your life just all of a sudden became a war zone and your parents had to make the really difficult choice, you know, do we leave? Do we leave and do we go somewhere so different from home, leaving behind so many family members? Do we make that hard choice? And like how difficult and how bad it would have to be before they make that choice. And I think then people start to think, but I think that's something that lots of us don't think about on an everyday basis because we have the privilege not to, because we live in such a safe place.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so going further back in time, your second book, Here We Are Now, is a young adult novel that came out in 2017, and it is about a girl who's trying to unravel her parents' past that her mother's kind of kept hidden from her, and she meets her father for the very first time at age 16. And so that kind of comes with the teaser that like our parents aren't always who we think they are. And I think that that's true even if you grow up with both of your parents, you know, and you like kind of discover who your parents are like when you're an adult almost. And I think that those sorts of questions about like family legacy and things like that are really important to a young person, a teenager, especially when they're trying to figure out like, who am I in the world and how does my family affect who I am and things like that. So were you like particularly interested in your own family history when you were growing up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was for a lot of the reasons actually I just answered the other question, and that so much of my family lived an ocean away. And so I think I wondered a lot about like what was lost. And my grandma died when I was really young and on my father's side, and my grandfather died not that long after. And so I almost felt like I'd really lost lots of these family stories, right? And so I'd ask lots of questions, but I think like my dad, and as he gets older, he will tell me more things and things that still surprise me that I'll be like, I had no idea about that with your childhood. Like I would love to know that, but I think that sometimes people who have gone through really difficult things also hold them really close. And I think it's different, but in some ways is what we were talking about with how like I was so reticent to want to talk to my kids about active shooter drills. I think he didn't want, he wanted me to have this kind of glossy American world and not know so much, right, about these other things. And so I think that definitely, but then I think also just like at a more global level, and I feel this way about my mother too, that you reach this point kind of as a teenager where you start to see your parents as complete people, and that means they also have flaws and textures. And I think at first when you're a teenager you can be really like mad about it because like when you're little your parents are superheroes, and then suddenly when you're a teenager all you see is the flaws because they're new to you, right? You're discovering them. And then I think as an adult you come to appreciate that your parents are humans just like anyone else, and they're fully textured, and that's a wonderful thing. That's actually a better thing than them being these like invaluable superheroes you thought they were when you know you were 5. But I kind of, again, that was like an extended metaphor for that, right? Of that process that you go through as a teenager of kind of being like, well, what does it mean that I don't necessarily like this thing about my mom or my dad, or I noticed this thing, this flaw in them? Does that mean that I have this same flaw? And like, how can I break free of that pattern? And what does that mean? And so, but like, how can you also do that in a way that like honors the like the love that you have for them, because it's like really like, complex. And so, and then as like a huge just fan of music, I've always also been interested in this idea of like, does the way you feel about like a song or an artist change if you know something about them that's like unsavory? And like that's a question that I think is like particularly interesting. I was like, how much of how you personally feel about the artist should inform how you feel about the art that they create.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's such a huge topic, you know, like so many people of our generation that grew up with like the Harry Potter books, and then like J.K. Rowling is like not the nicest person, it turns out. And then everyone's like, but I like, is it still okay for me to be like a Harry Potter fan? You know what I mean? I mean, there's like tons of examples, but that's like one of the biggest ones that I feel like people.
And again, talk about things that are really hard, because I feel like too, I see that with like younger kids who are falling in love with Harry Potter who don't know to know, like they don't know what Twitter is,
Right.
right? So like, how do you
Right.
even have that conversation to be like, this is
Right.
a little bit complex? And like, yeah, it is hard that now, like, does wearing a Hogwarts shirt mean something different than you intend it to mean? Yeah,
Right.
those kind of things are always like interesting to me. And I think the more we enter into this new era, sort of knowing everything about everyone, the more that's going to
Yeah.
come into play.
Yeah, for sure. Your debut YA novel from 2015 is called My Heart and Other Black Holes. It follows a teen girl with a somewhat tragic backstory, it sounds like, who's obsessed with planning her own suicide, and she makes a friend online who's kind of following that same trajectory. I know a lot of authors have like a special connection to their debut. So what was it about like this story in particular that made it be like the first one that you brought into the world?
Yeah, so I don't want to be like flippant here with this answer because it is
Yeah.
special to me, and I'm going to talk about why it's special to me and why I think it was unique. But the reason that it's the first story I brought into this world is it was the first story that someone said yes to. You know, like I had been writing and trying other books before then, and
Yeah.
people did not say yes, and I was met with rejection, as I'm sure lots of people you've talked to have kind of explained that type of story. But this book came about at a really unique kind of crossroads in my life where in January of 2013, I unexpectedly lost one of my very, very closest friends. And so I was thinking a lot about death and the reality of death. And I was also thinking about when you have a mental illness, how sometimes you're an unreliable narrator of yourself and how important the people in your life are who see you clearly when you don't see yourself clearly. And my friend was one of those people for me. And so I wrote the book in a way to kind of process my grief, think about all these things. And so the book isn't about my friend at all. And I always feel like I need to be really careful here. My friend did not commit suicide. It's not at all like about my friend, but it is about the love that I have for my friend and the ways that relationships, particularly really deep friendships, can be really life-saving. And it's about mental illness, making you an unreliable narrator, and it's about kind of the intractability of grief and all of these things that I was wondering about. And I wrote the book in this really fast period, faster than I've ever written a book and probably ever will. And so it was a really unique writing experience. And I think it's very different from anything I'll ever write again. And I feel so lucky that it was my debut and it opened a lot of doors for me. But I also think it's funny because I don't necessarily think it was super indicative of the types of books that I would maybe go on to write or will write in the future. And so that's always like interesting. It wasn't as if I had lots of finished books and selected this book as being like, oh, this is like the one that I should really try to debut with. It was more that that was the book that came to me at the time. And I tried my hand again at kind of the publishing lottery and won, you know, with that book.
Nice.
And so that was my debut. And I feel so lucky that it found the readers that it did and being the audience that it did. And like I said, it opened a lot of doors for me, but it's also now feels so different from like the projects that I'm working on. But I guess that probably maybe is how it always is. Like you probably grow as a creator. But I think for me specifically, just because that book was so singular and came out of such a very particular moment.
Yeah, definitely. So your first two books were young adult and your last three have been middle grade. Is that correct?
Yes.
So you, is that a trend you see continuing, or are you planning to do more YA in the future, or do you have plans for what age groups you're writing for?
Yeah, so I love middle grade. That's kind of always been where my heart was. All the books, most of the books that I tried to write before my first book were middle grade. And so it felt inevitable to me that I would try to return to that space. And now that they've let me back in that space, I feel like that's probably where I'll stay for a while. For me, I love this intersection middle grade has of that childlike wonder and childlike imagination playing with this increased awareness of the world. And so for me, that tension is like a really beautiful place to write into. And the hardest years of my life were like from like 4th to 8th grade. And so I think a lot of times we return to that place in our life that we felt like really lonely and uncomfortable. And that's kind of a fertile ground to pull emotional stories from. But that said, like I'm doing a lot of young adult anthologies. Like I'm in one that's coming out, actually 2 that are coming out next year where I've written a short story. So I'm definitely still love like the young adult space. and
Yeah.
will continue to play in that space. And I think maybe work in it in like different formats. But right now for novels, I think at least my next couple novels will definitely be middle grade.
Nice. Do you have another book in the works already?
Yeah, so I'm I am working and trying to write the next book, which is loosely right now, it's a summer trip story. It's two sisters who are Arab American, but they're going back to their mother's home country of Jordan for the first time. And it's sort of
Nice.
loosely based off of my summer trips back to Jordan when I was a kid, but it's a little bit more like hijinksy. I'm trying to write like what feels like a classic cozy middle grade novel, like those kinds of books that I grew up with that were like summer family trips that kind of have sort of mysterious hijinks and things like that, but set in the Middle East. Because I feel like so often when we see the Middle Eastern books, it's like super political or it's about conflict. And like Other Words for Home has this too, and that like it's really centered around the conflict in Syria. And I think those books are really important. I think it's really important to talk about, what is happening in the Middle East, what people are going through. But also, like, for me, my experience as a kid there in Jordan was so different than any media that I really see representing the Middle East. And so I wanted to kind of like flip that on its head and just tell this really gentle, cozy family story, but have the setting sort of be Jordan, which is a really fun and beautiful country. And so kind of working my way through that, but I'm in this sort of maddening first draft type stage where like I have the pieces, but I have to figure out how to make them click.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. My husband actually studied abroad in Jordan for a semester when he was in college, and he loved it there. And he tells me all the time that like we're gonna have to figure out how to go back so he can show me like all these beautiful places that he got to visit. So
that's awesome. That's really cool.
Yeah, that's super cool. So all of your books have super beautiful covers on them. I'm a huge like art and book cover nerd. So how much of a say do you get to have in the designs, and have you worked with the same artist for each one, and how does that kind of work?
Yeah, so at Harper, there is an art director, designer. I'm not exactly sure what her exact title is, and Jenna, I'm sorry if you're listening to this and I botched it, but she works in their art design department, and her name Jenna Stemple, and she's worked on all of my covers, and she's amazing. And she kind of, I think, reads the book, comes up with a concept, and then because Jenna is the genius she is, always comes up with like the artist she's going to hire for the project. And so all of my books have had a different cover artist that has been hired out, but Jenna and On the Shape of Thunder, Alice were the point people who sort of figured out who that artist would be, and I think worked with them on coming up with a concept. And my understanding is like, so for like Other Words for Home, Anusha Syed was the illustrator, and she made this beautiful image and like came up with this concept. And then I think Jenna did like the lettering. So I think it's like a joint effort is my understanding. And so in terms of how much say I get, so I usually see it when there's like a mock-up. So I know they go through lots of different like ideas of what the cover could be, because I know like for a Rover story, so Matt Rockefeller is the illustrator for a Rover story, and actually Rover story is also going to have full page art sketches in it. There's a couple of them. It's not like a fully illustrated book, but there's art in the book too. Nice. But I know that Matt and Jenna went back and forth and had some different concepts. And then I saw it once. It was like basically this concept, a little bit different, but only in black and white, and like kind of where the text was might be different. And then I'll say something maybe like, can we make the title bigger? Can we make it smaller? Can we move it down? Or blah, 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 blah. But usually I'm just like, it's so exciting. It looks so great. And I think in part that's been because I have such a great team that I think Jenna really gets the books, and everything that is sent to me is always really like exciting. You can remember with The Shape of Thunder, we went back and forth a little bit about in the bottom, there's these figures who are supposed to be representations of Quinn's brother and Cora's sister. And one of the silhouettes didn't look right to me. And so we went back and forth about how to do that. But those are like little changes that will be tweaked. But for the most part, that is the design department's purview. And again, one of those pluses I think of kind of having the traditional publishing team maybe behind you, and that they do that and they make the book beautiful. And I kind of just say, thank you. And it looks amazing.
That's awesome. Well, they do look amazing. Yeah, I love all of your book covers. You still do have like a day job. You are an MFA professor. Is that what I read?
Yeah. So I teach in the Vermont College of Fine Arts program. And so that's supposed to be like a 1/4 of the time job because
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of slow and also really obsessed with my students. I feel like it feels more like a part-time job than a quarter
Yeah.
job, but
Yeah.
that's its own thing. I really love it. I love getting to kind of nerd out about those kind of craft ideas. For me, it's really nice because it's something in my life that's really centered around writing and craft. And I feel like publishing, the longer you get into it, can feel centered around sort of the more like glamorous and glossy elements we were talking about earlier. Like, are you going on book tour? How are you promoting your book?
Right.
What are your sales like? And those are all exciting things and meaningful things, and I'm so grateful like have those things to wonder and worry about. But at the end of the day, I think sometimes I need to spend a little bit more time with my writer hat, and the VCFA
Yeah.
job really keeps that writer hat on, as opposed to
Yeah.
the author hat. And I feel like those are two different hats.
Yeah, definitely. That's cool. What is the best writing advice you've ever received, or what is the best piece of writing advice that you give out to your students?
So these are the same piece of advice. I'm
Yeah.
not really sure where I got it from first. What I always say is the best writers I know are the best readers. And I know that sounds so
Mm.
simple, but I think that really writing is a conversation, right? It's about
Mhm.
understanding what you have to say in relation to what has already been said in other stories. And I think the best way to figure that out is from reading lots of things and thinking about how they make you feel and why you like them and observing what works in the writing. And so I think so many people I know tell me they want to be writers. And then I say, well, what do you like to read? And they're like, well, I don't really read. And that always surprises me because I am a reader before I'm a writer. And I really think
Mm.
that that is so important. I know it sounds so
Yeah.
simple, but really
Yeah.
reading and reading everything you possibly can. So yes, reading in the genre that you want to write in is so important. That's the other thing. Like I'll meet people who they want to write middle grade books, but they haven't read a middle grade book since they were a middle schooler. And it's like you need to read some middle grade books to figure out
Yeah.
like what kind of middle grade book you want to write. And I think along those lines, which is like a kind of a secondary piece of advice, but something I always try to urge people, and again, I don't want this to sound flippant, but to let go of this pressure to feel like you have to be original. I think I almost kind of describe writing as, composing something on the piano. We all only have the same keys, right? And so we're going to come up with a lot of the same things. It's about figuring out how you can individually put that together. Like what individual spin can you put on it? Less so than like, how can you come up with something that has never been done before? Because when people try to say, I have something that's never been done before, to me, that's always the alarm bell that person has not read and done a lot of reading. So, like, I think that because I think the more that you read, the more comforted you'll be about this idea that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and the books that you love may feel familiar in some ways to other books, and that might actually be part of their appeal. But how do they do that in a way that still feels like singular and distinct?
Yeah, definitely. That is really good advice. What is the best book that you've read in the last year?
Well, I'm excited because just last week I finished a book that I feel like is now in my top 10 favorite books of all time. It blew me away. It was
Oh
so
yeah.
good. It was called Tomorrow, Tomorrow, Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. And
Okay.
it is a novel for grown-ups, but it's about actually these two friends, Sadie and Sam, who they meet when they're kids. Sam has been in a really terrible accident. He's at a children's hospital, and Sadie's there because her sister has cancer, but they bond over playing video games in the hospital. But the novel spans like 30 years and follows them from the time of being kids in this hospital to them becoming video game designers themselves. But I feel like, especially for writers, this is a book that has so much appeal because it really has all these like metaphorical and kind of philosophical musings on the nature of like creating worlds and why do we love to escape into different worlds and what does it mean to play a game and why is that so appealing? But it's just so artfully done. Like I'm not really a big gamer. Like I grew up playing kind of like Mario Kart and Mario Kart like other people, but I'm not like a really heavy like RPG gamer person. And so at first I was like, I don't know, like if I'm gonna love the book. And some friends of mine were like, no, read it. And it just hooked me. The characters felt so real. It's one of those books that I'm so sad it's over. I still think about it like every day.
Oh yeah. Nice. I'll have to add that one to my to be read list. That sounds really good. What's been your favorite or most memorable experience since you've become a published author?
I think it's been connecting with young readers, and both
Yeah.
connecting with young readers who are of Arab and or Muslim descent. Like, I've had some really moving meetings where it's like I do a school visit and they let me have lunch with like the Muslim Student Association, or all the kids come up to me and say, "This is the first time I ever saw someone like me in a book, or someone like my family member in a book."
Well,
And that's so meaningful to me because I had that experience of never finding on a shelf when I was growing up a character who came from the same kind of background that I came from. I learned how to find myself in characters, right? Like, I found myself
yeah.
in Anne of Green Gables, and I found myself in Ellen Shannon, but it's a squeezing, right? It's a different type of
Yeah.
way. And so to like have that sort of affirmation that like
Mhm.
their stories matter and their voices matter, that's so like meaningful to me to have those exchanges. But then also kids who all go on school visits to districts that are not that diverse. And I will get these letters back from kids that will say things like, I used to be really afraid of Muslims, and now I have like a whole new understanding. And so to me, like, that's so reaffirming the power of books and the power of books to
Yeah.
shape and change and open our minds, but also just how lovely young people are, that from reading a
Mhm.
book their perspective can be shifted and opened, and how open and willing to like love and accept the world they want to be and are. And so to me, all of my best moments as an author have come just from interacting with the readers,
Yeah.
young people, because I really think that's the biggest joy of writing for middle grade, is that we have the very, very best readers.
Oh, that's so sweet. That's really awesome. Cause I remember, of course I've been an avid reader like my whole life too. And I do remember being like so attached to books and characters when I was that age, but it never occurred to me that like authors were like real people that you could talk to. You know what I mean? Like, I never was the type of kid that was like writing fan mail or anything like that. And so like, I don't remember ever having an author visit to my school. So it's like so cool that those things happen for kids now. And like, especially with the internet, like authors are like people that you can like interact with more readily and things like that. That's
Yeah.
just a really neat
No, I
aspect
tell
of
kids
it.
that all the time at author visits. So, like, I wanted to be an author, but that didn't seem like a job that real people had. And so that's one of my most
Yeah.
favorite things, to visit schools and be like, I'm a very real, regular person who, most days is taking my kids to soccer practice and doing laundry, but I'm also like making things up on my computer, and that's my job. And those things all like exist in that same sort of normal realm. And that's a fun thing to get to share.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is there a legacy that you hope to leave behind with your work, or is that like way too big of a question?
No, I love that question. I think it would be one of my very favorite writers for young people, is Katie Camillo. And she says something along the lines of, in writing for young people, we're tasked with this like very important task of growing hearts. Or she says it more eloquently because she's Katie Camillo, but it's something along the lines of that, of like growing hearts,
Yeah.
making hearts bigger. And I think that is the legacy that I would hope to leave behind, is that from reading my books, there's young people who have become just a little bit kinder, or a little bit more accepting, or a little bit more gentle with other people in their life, and also with them. Like, I think that's the biggest thing. To quote another kind of giant of children's literature, like E.B. White, I think famously said that all he ever is trying to say with his books is that I love the world. And I think that I want kids, because I write about really hard things, but I always say that what I want them to come away with is this feeling that they love themselves, and they love the people in their community, and they love the world enough to want to make it a better place. And so I think
Yeah.
like that's would be my biggest hope, is that somehow my body of work like edges in that direction, no matter like how
Yeah.
small that movement is.
That's really wonderful. That's pretty much my last question. So, do you have a call to action for the audience, or do you have anything that you'd like to say or promote before we cap off the interview?
No, just to say thank you. And for people who are listening, I hope in October you'll consider picking up a copy of a Rover story. I'm really excited to share it with everyone and see what you think about my little Rover.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today. To our audience, be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content in the future.